So in this video, I'm going to be going over how to handle negative feedback better. And another word for negative feedback, at least if it's done well, is constructive feedback. And it's called constructive feedback because it actually helps you improve and grow as a designer. And also at the end of the video, I'll talk a little bit about how to better give feedback. So if someone ever asks you for your thoughts or your critique on their work, you can hopefully phrase it in a way that's most helpful to them. And also for this video, it's going to be pretty much audio only, so feel free not to watch the actual video part, as it will just be some really brightly colored slides. So the most important thing to consider here is that feedback equals growth. If you never get any feedback, positive or negative, on what you're doing, knowing what direction to pursue in the future is really almost impossible. It'll all just be your own personal thoughts and feelings, which won't lead you in, at least most cases, an exciting new direction. You might get stuck doing the same stuff over and over again, or you might keep making the same mistakes over and over again to the point where it becomes really hard for you to ever correct those mistakes. Whenever you get stuck in a certain pattern and you keep making those pattern choices over and over, your brain sort of hardwires to make those choices, to make those decisions. So getting effective feedback to prevent that from happening as soon as possible is extremely useful, which is why feedback and critiques are such an important part of art and design in general. And also something to consider here too, when it comes to feedback, negative feedback isn't something that people necessarily want to get, or if you want to look at it a little bit better, constructive feedback. But ultimately, if all that you ever got was super positive feedback saying something like, your work is the best, this is perfect, don't change a thing, that doesn't really instruct you how to improve or what you could iterate on for the future, because you're basically just being told to keep on doing exactly what you're doing and don't change a thing. So with the negative or constructive feedback, that can help you decide what directions to pursue for the future, what changes to make, and how you can ultimately improve as a designer. So something really important with any form of feedback is that you consider the source. So for example, when I make a YouTube video, there's only a few different ways that people can really leave feedback. There's the thumbs up or thumbs down button, which is pretty much the least interactive way someone can actually go out of their way to leave feedback. So when I'm considering the source of a thumbs up or a thumbs down, it's pretty minimal in terms of how I interact with that. If a video has more thumbs down than thumbs ups, I can probably assume that the video wasn't very good. But if one person, for example, leaves the thumbs down button to say, I didn't like this video, it kind of sucked, without leaving any additional comments in the comment section to let me know what to improve, I can only basically get stuck in my own mind about what that particular person may or may not have liked about that video, which ultimately isn't super helpful to me. So that source wouldn't be super important. But something above that, where if someone were to leave an actual comment explaining what they either did or didn't like, I'll take that more seriously, because that person put some considered thought into what they wanted me to either improve or what they liked about the video in a way that an action that doesn't actually critique what I'm doing doesn't do. And actually, for me personally, some of the most effective things that I've ever gotten have been extremely negative. I wouldn't even call it constructive criticism, because it was essentially just saying what you're doing really sucks. I still distinctly remember someone, I think it was Reddit, which, by the way, if you're ever looking for negative feedback, Reddit might be one of the best places to go. But someone essentially said that the videos were way too long. The end result of the video wasn't teaching something useful to the person. And that was actually really helpful feedback, even though the person framed it in perhaps the most negative way they could have possibly done, by highlighting the importance of making sure videos aren't way too long and that the things I'm showing in those videos are actually useful to people. Because in the video specifically that they critiqued me on, they mentioned that the way that I came to the end result wasn't the way normal people would work. And I actually wasn't working the way I would normally work in that video, because I wanted to make it as easily reproducible as possible. But because of that, I ended up making a lot of really long steps that weren't an effective use of time and ultimately were teaching people bad practices. So because of that super negative feedback, I was able to greatly improve my videos in the future. And also, you can't weigh something like the opinion of, let's say, your average person who's not a designer, who just is looking at your work for the first time, versus someone who is a professional designer, versus someone who is perhaps a professional design instructor. All of these might have different weights in terms of how much importance you should place on them. That being said, every piece of feedback that you get is valid for its own reason, because that person has a reason for having their opinions. For example, if someone who's not a designer makes a comment about what you're doing that might not make sense to you as a designer, because you perhaps know more about the subject and the reasons why you made the choices you did than that person does, ultimately that person is perhaps a potential customer. That person is perhaps someone who might buy your work in the future if you're doing something like a t-shirt design. Because with things like t-shirt designs, I've seen just absolutely terrible designs sell thousands and thousands of t-shirts because the subject matter was on point, because it made people relate with whatever that particular design was. Even if from a technical standpoint, the design was super poorly made, the feedback that person might have gotten from potential customers about the intent to purchase is really important if your end goal is selling something to them. Whereas someone who's critiquing it solely for the design merits might call you out on bad kerning for the words, on really sloppy execution of the design idea, which is of course super helpful to know, but by considering the source and where it's coming from and where that person's perspective is, it'll really help you decide how to utilize that feedback and how to apply it to your work. For example, I wouldn't ask an average person about the quality of my pen tool use, and if I made all the Bezier curves on my lines perfectly or not. I might ask someone who's super into using Illustrator and the pen tool that, if I was being effective and useful there, but the average person has no idea what that even means. So ultimately, you want to ask the right people the right questions whenever you can. And also, just as a side note with this, when gathering feedback for whatever it is that you're doing, try to stay clear of family and friends as a source of actual important critique, because it's very rare to have a family member or a friend willing to give you their absolutely unbiased opinion. Because ultimately, if they are your family members, if they are your friends, they probably don't want to hurt your feelings, which means that you can't really trust the information they're telling you. And of course, everyone's different. You might have some friends that you absolutely feel like you can totally trust what they say as being unbiased and accurate, and that is a call that you're going to have to make. But just as a general rule, steer clear of family and friends for trying to get the most important feedback when you're actually designing and developing a new thing. And just something to keep in mind in general is always try to find the good in a super negative statement, because it's probably there somewhere if you dig hard enough. And if you can't in any way find any useful information from something that someone wrote to you, then that piece of feedback just isn't valid. It ultimately did no good for you. It ultimately did no good for the person that left it. So like in the example I said earlier, where the person said, basically, your video is complete trash. Why would anyone watch this? You're not teaching the people how to create something useful, and you're also doing it in a strange way that takes way too long. So although they framed their critique of what I was doing in a really bad way by just being unnecessarily negative, they also gave the really important feedback of saying you're not teaching people something that they actually care about, and you're taking way too long to make it happen. So those pieces of feedback I actually used and applied in future videos. So that piece of really negative feedback that was written in a way that just wasn't constructive ultimately ended up being one of the more helpful pieces of feedback I've ever gotten. So always try to find the good in any statement and then use those little good bits, however small they might be, to improve your work. And this one is super important to me because it's one of the most frustrating things I see people do when they get negative feedback of any type. And that's becoming really defensive. And perhaps my least favorite of any tactic I see people use is comparing their work to other people's work after you've, for example, given it a negative critique or a negative feedback and saying, well, my work is better than this work, and you said that work was good, therefore my work also has to be good. Basically raising themselves on a pedestal above someone else because in their opinion, they were doing better work and they didn't feel that the other person deserve the positive feedback or success that they were getting. Ultimately, that doesn't help you as the person trying to defend yourself. It makes you look pretty bad because if your way of trying to get ahead in life is to hold other people down or criticize them, it just doesn't make you look like a good person. It also shows that you can't really handle the critiques or handle the feedback that is required to make you better at what you're doing. So if you ever consider doing that as a way to defend yourself, just stop and think a little bit and ask yourself, is this really helping prove my point? Is this helping that other person that I'm critiquing in any way? Or is it actually just a hurtful statement towards the other person while being extremely defensive, trying to hold your work to the highest standard that you can? And that's not to say that you can't have attitudes that are perhaps considered unhealthy towards your work. For example, jealousy is a term that most people would consider a very negative trait to have. But I was listening to Ollie Moss talk about his work, and someone asked him if he ever became jealous of other designers. And just as a side note, if you don't know who Ollie Moss is, I'm a big fan of his work. He's a super talented Illustrator designer. I'll leave a link to his website in the description so you can check it out, just so you have the context of who I'm talking about. But what Ollie said about jealousy was that he becomes jealous all the time of other designers, and that jealousy specifically is one of his biggest motivators to become better. So that was really impactful for me to hear, understanding that you can take a negative feeling, a negative thing that most people wouldn't want to apply to themselves, like jealousy. And you can use that jealousy to push yourself to become better, because ultimately, in that context, him being jealous of that other person's work meant that he really respected it. He thought it was so good that he was jealous that he did not create it himself. And that inspired him to want to create work at that level in the future, in whatever his own way might be. So ultimately, don't be afraid to embrace some more negative traits that your mind might come to, but try to rework those thoughts in a way that pushes you to do better work rather than pushes you to hold other people down. And just some really quick tips for giving feedback in case someone ever asks you for feedback and you want to be as helpful as possible. Always try to be constructive when you give feedback. You want to help someone build something better, not just say that it's terrible or bad. It's always really important with any piece of feedback that feedback is actionable in some way, that it gives a path for the other person to go down to consider in order to make their work better. Examples of really bad feedback are something like, this just doesn't work, or your color choices suck, or saying something as simple as, I don't like this. Ultimately, that doesn't give the person you're talking to any path to improve. It's just putting their work down, but not giving them any sort of specifics as to why. And it's always the whys that matter the most when giving good feedback. So part of figuring out what the whys are is ask good questions to the person you're trying to critique. If they made a strange choice or a choice you don't agree with, ask them why they made that choice. Ask them why they used the colors they used or why they used the subject matter they used. Because ultimately, it's important to understand where that person's coming from, where their mind was when they were making those choices, because that'll help inform you how to better help them find a better or more effective path to answering those questions that they might have had. And if you ever ask someone a question as to perhaps like, why did you use this font? Like, what was going through your head when you pick this instead of perhaps this other option? If they answer, I don't know, it's just kind of what I did, that's a good sign to you that they perhaps needed to spend more time thinking about the choices they were making. And then you can use that as the exact feedback that you give back to them. So for example, if someone uses a giant picture of a squirrel on a poster about dolphins, you can be like, why did you use a squirrel? That doesn't make any sense in the context. Like, what was your thought process behind that? If they're like, I just like squirrels, you can let them know that that wasn't a really good choice and that they need to make deeper considerations when picking things and not to pick things just because they look pretty or that happens to be their favorite animal, for example. And like I said before, always try to offer solutions or at least a path for them to go down. It's really easy to tell someone that something is bad, but it's much more difficult to offer a really good solution to help solve the problem that you're pointing out. So whenever you want to point out a problem with someone's work, also try to consider, what is your proposed solution? It doesn't have to be complex. It could be something as simple as saying, use a thinner line weight. It might help this show up better. Or use a different color palette to help emphasize what you're trying to point out. Whatever the case might be for the design in question, offering things that person can actually take action on is super important, and it'll be far more helpful to the person you're talking to than simply pointing out the mistakes without offering them any path to pursue or perhaps reconsider the way that they were going about solving the problem. It's why, for example, when you work with someone, or let's say you're hiring someone, it's important to try to find people to work with that are always willing to critique what you're doing and not simply agree with everything. And then if they happen to have disagreements, that they're willing to quickly show different ways of thinking or approaching the problem from their perspective to help you grow and learn from it. Because if someone just always agrees with you, that doesn't offer any path for growth. But at the same time, if someone just always disagrees with you but gives you no viable solutions from the disagreement, they merely point out they don't like what you're doing, that also doesn't offer you a path to growth. So you always want to make sure, no matter what, to offer some kind of solution, however simple or complex it might be, to help that person perhaps go down a path and let them make the choice if that is right for them or not. But I'd certainly love to hear your thoughts on this subject, and if you have any further questions, feel free to check out the comments section below the video, where you can either critique this video, let me know what you liked or didn't like, and I can of course respond to those, or if you have questions about critiques or feedback in general, or any situations that you've run into that perhaps you're kind of stuck on in your mind and you want someone else to help process why someone might have said something or how you could have better approached handling a piece of feedback that you got. All these things are really important, and it's really easy to get stuck on the negatives when you're receiving feedback. For example, when I make a video, I always remember the negative comments far more than the positive comments, because for whatever reason, the human mind is kind of built and designed to hold on to those negative thoughts that people might send your way. So it's always important to try to find a better balance so that you're not stuck on the negatives and you can actually celebrate when someone says something really awesome about what you're doing as well. But that is it for this video. If you liked it, please hit the thumbs up button to let me know, and perhaps consider, like I said before, leaving a comment letting me know why so I can improve or do more of that in the future. And if you like this content and you want to see some more stuff like this, feel free to subscribe. I do my very best to keep creating new content for designers. But that is it. Thank you so much for watching.